Good day, everyone. Today, we will discuss about disaster risk reduction and management. Let's start from the introduction. The Philippines is located in the Circum-Pacific belt of fire and typhoon. This being so, the country has always been subjected to natural disaster and calamities any time of the year. In whatever part of the country, we have been experiencing yearly natural calamities like floods, typhoons, tornadoes, earthquakes, drought, fire, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions, which have brought incessant miseries to our people, note the loss of lives and properties. So in the mid-70s and 80s, strong typhoons and torrential rains brought devastation to Manila and large areas of central Luzon. The 1990 killer earthquake that hit several Luzon provinces as well as Metro Manila and the effects of the 1991 Mount Pinatubo eruption had put the National Disaster Coordinating Council in the forefront. So, to enhance the people's preparedness and ensure precision and spontaneity in responding to emergencies and or catastrophes, the NDCC, which was changed to National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council or NDRRMC, together with the concerned agencies, conduct regular mobilization exercises and drills at all levels with the participation of the private agencies concerned and non-government organization. The overview of the Philippine Disaster Management System. The Republic Act Number 10121, also known as the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, an act strengthening the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management System, providing for the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Framework, and institutionalizing the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Plan, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes. So the following are the salient features Act of 10121 of 2010. So the first one is NDCC became National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council or NDRRMC. Next is the formulation of a National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Framework and the National Disaster Risk Reduction Plan. Then the next is Framework for Climate Change Adaptation and Disaster Risk Reduction and Management. And then the RDCC, PDCC, CMDCC into local disaster risk reduction and management councils. The OCD directors as chair of the Regional Disaster Risk Reduction and the Management Council with Regional DSWD, DILG, DOST, and NEDA as features except Mindanao, where the regional government act as chair and OCD as a secretariat of the RDRRMC. Then next is BDCC integrated with the Barangay Development Council, Coordinating Council, and then the creation of the Local Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Office, accreditation, mobilization, and protection of disaster volunteers and National Service Corps, CSOs, and the private sector. And the last one is integration of disaster risk reduction education into school curricula and SK programs as well as mandatory training for public sector employees. Then let's proceed to the disaster risk reduction and management concepts. The following are the definition of terms. The first is the hazard. It is a dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihood and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. The next is risk. So it is the combination of the probability of an event and its negative consequences. And then the vulnerability. It is the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or assets that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. Vulnerability may arise from various physical, social, economic, and environmental factors such as poor design and construction of buildings, inadequate protection of assets, lack of public information and awareness, limited official recognition of risk and preparedness measures, and also the disregard of wise environmental damage. So the next is disaster. It is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. And then the adaptation is the adjustment in natural or human system in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. And the next is the disaster mitigation. So it is the lessening or limitation of the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. So mitigation measures encompasses engineering techniques and hazard resistance construction as well as improved environmental policies and public awareness. So next is disaster preparedness. The disaster preparedness is the knowledge and the capacities developed by governments, professional response and recovery organizations, communities, and individuals to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of likely, imminent, or current hazard events or conditions. So disaster preparedness action is carried out within the context of disaster risk reduction and management and aims to build the capacities needed to efficiently manage all types of emergencies and achieve orderly transitions from response to sustained recovery. So the next one is disaster prevention. It is the outright avoidance of adverse impacts of hazard and related disaster. It also expresses the concept and intention to completely avoid potential adverse impacts through action taken in advance, such as construction of dams or embankments that eliminate the flood risk, the seismic engineering designs that ensures the survival and the function of critical building in any likely earthquake. And then next is disaster response. It is the provision of emergency services and public assistance during or immediately after a disaster in order to save lives, reduce health impacts, ensure public safety, and meet the basic subsistence needs of the people affected. So disaster response is predominantly focused on immediate and short-term needs and is sometimes called disaster relief. Next is disaster risk. It is the potential disaster losses in lives, health status, livelihood, assets and services, which could occur to a particular community or society over some specified future time period. And then disaster risk reduction. It is the concept and practice of reducing disaster risk through systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters, including through reduced exposures of hazards, lessen vulnerability of people and property, wise management of land and environmental and improved preparedness for adverse events. And then the last one is disaster risk reduction and management. It is the systematic process of using administrative directives, organizations, and operational skills and capacities to implement strategies, policies, and improve coping capacities in order to lessen the adverse impacts of hazards, and the possibility of disaster. So, prospective disaster risk reduction and management refers to risk reduction and management activities that address and seek to avoid the development of new or increased disaster risk, especially if risk reduction policies are not put in place. So let's proceed to the four phases of disaster management. So all organizations are in at least one phase of any given moment in time. Understanding these four phases will empower your organization to prepare for and respond to crisis in a smarter, more informed way. Making the right decision will give your organization the best chance at survival and recovery following an anticipated event. So take a look closer. Let's take a closer look of each of the disaster management phases means. So the first one is mitigation. It is to prevent future emergencies and take steps to minimize their effects. So the mitigation phase occurs before a disaster takes place. So here, an organization will take steps to protect people and property while also decreasing risk and the consequences from a given disaster situation. The organization's main goal is to reduce vulnerability to disaster impacts such as property damage, injury, and loss of life. So examples of mitigation include conducting a property inspection to discover ways to fortify the building against damage. The phase two is preparedness. It is to take actions ahead of time to be ready for an emergency. So the preparedness phase also occurs before a disaster takes place. So here, an organization attempts to understand how a disaster might affect overall productivity and the bottom line. The organization will also provide appropriate education while putting preparedness measures into place. So examples of preparedness may include hosting training, education, drills, tabletop exercises, and full-scale exercises on disaster preparedness. Uh, this is to ensure that stakeholders know what to do in the event of an emergency. So the third phase is response. So it is to protect people and property in the wake of an emergency, disaster or crisis. So the response phase occurs in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. Organization must focus their attention on addressing immediate threats to people, property, and business. So occupant safety and well-being largely depends on its preparedness levels before disaster strikes. So the most notable example of the response phase is to ensure that people are out of harm's way. And the last phase is the recovery, meaning to rebuild after a disaster in an effort to return operations back to normal. So the recovery phase takes place after a disaster. So this phase is the restoration of an organization following any impacts from a disaster. So by this time, the organization has achieved at least some degree of physical, environmental, economic, and social stability.